Some stories begin in the most ordinary places, yet they uncover the deepest truths about human nature. That's exactly what happened one afternoon inside a bustling bank branch. The air was thick with impatience. Long lines stretched across the lobby, customers shifting on their feet, sighing in frustration. Tellers moved frantically, their voices clipped and hurried. The rhythmic tapping of keyboards blended with the occasional murmur of complaint, creating an atmosphere of barely contained tension. Amidst the chaos stood Maggie Thompson, an elderly woman clutching a worn envelope. Her fingers trembled slightly as she held it close to her chest, as if the paper itself carried the weight of her worries. To the others, she was just another customer in line. But for Maggie, this was more than just a routine visit. This was about survival. Maggie had come seeking answers. What looked like a minor error in her account was, for her, a matter of survival. She had spent a lifetime managing every dollar carefully, making sure she had enough to cover her needs. But today, something didn't add up, and she needed someone to listen. Taking a steady breath, she stepped forward toward the service counter. She adjusted her coat, trying to compose herself, but the weight of uncertainty pressed on her shoulders. "I just need them to fix this," she whispered, gripping the envelope tighter as she glanced around the room. Across the lobby, Todd Murphy, the bank's assistant manager, strode through the chaos. His eyes flickered over the crowd, assessing each customer, not by their need, but by their worth in his eyes. Those in designer suits or carrying thick portfolios caught his attention. Maggie Thompson, with her aging coat and anxious grip on a single envelope, did not. For Todd, some customers mattered more than others. And Maggie, she wasn't one of them. Todd Murphy moved through the bank with a practiced indifference, his sharp gaze scanning the crowd. Without a word, he made silent judgments, instinctively prioritizing those who looked like they mattered. Men in crisp suits, women carrying expensive handbags, customers whose presence suggested wealth and importance. For Todd, some concerns were worth addressing. Others, not so much. And Maggie Thompson, standing there with her worn-out envelope and nervous hands, barely registered on his radar. Maggie hesitated, glancing around as if searching for reassurance. She knew this wouldn't be easy. Taking a deep breath, she stepped up to the counter. She didn't know it yet, but this moment, this seemingly simple request for help, was about to turn into something much bigger. By the time the afternoon was over, Maggie wouldn't just be fighting for an answer. She'd be fighting to hold on to her dignity. But something unexpected was about to happen. Maggie approached the service counter, her fingers tightening around the envelope. Sitting behind the glass was Brittany Carter, a young teller with tired eyes and an expression that barely masked her impatience. She glanced up for a split second before returning her focus to her keyboard, typing away without urgency. "Good afternoon, ma'am. How can I help you?" Brittany asked, her tone flat, her eyes still locked on the screen. Maggie adjusted the envelope in her hands, gathering her courage. She took a slow breath, forcing a polite smile. "Good afternoon," she said softly. "I'm here because my account has some charges that I believe are incorrect. I brought all the documents with me to figure this out." For the first time, Brittany actually looked at her. But there was no warmth, no concern, just indifference. She let out a small sigh, reached for the envelope with one hand, and flipped through the papers lazily, barely scanning them. Maggie stood there waiting, hoping. She had no idea this was just the beginning. Brittany's gaze remained indifferent. She barely glanced at the papers as she flipped through them with mechanical disinterest. "Let's see. Ah, here it is," she muttered. "These charges are standard, ma'am. They're all outlined in your account agreement." Without a second thought, she pushed the envelope back toward Maggie, as if the matter was already settled. Maggie's stomach tightened. That wasn't the answer she had hoped for. "But I can't afford these fees," she said, her voice laced with concern. "This must be a mistake. I was never informed about these charges." Brittany let out an exaggerated sigh and rolled her eyes, her impatience now on full display. A few customers nearby turned their heads, sensing the tension. "Ma'am, maybe you don't understand how things work these days," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. Maggie swallowed hard. It wasn't just the words. It was the way she said them. As if Maggie was the problem. As if she was just too old to keep up. And for the first time, she felt it. That creeping, humiliating feeling that she wasn't being taken seriously. But she wasn't about to give up. Brittany barely suppressed a smirk as she delivered her next words with cold indifference. "Banks have policies, ma'am. These fees are automatic. There's nothing I can do." Her tone was sharp, laced with barely concealed disdain. Maggie felt her heart sink. The response didn't just dismiss her concerns, it made her feel small, as if she didn't even deserve an explanation. A lump formed in her throat as she tried to steady herself, willing away the sting of humiliation. She wasn't asking for special treatment. She just wanted to be heard. In a near whisper, she pleaded, "I just want what's fair." Brittany leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms, the corner of her lips curling ever so slightly. She liked having control over the situation. "Fair?" she scoffed. "If you want to avoid fees, you need to keep more money in your account. That's how it works." And just like that, the public humiliation began. Murmurs spread through the line behind Maggie. She could feel the weight of strangers' eyes on her, some watching with curiosity, others shaking their heads in silent judgment. She clutched the envelope tighter, standing her ground. But inside, a quiet sense of defeat was creeping in. And the worst part? No one was coming to help her. Not yet. The whispers grew louder. Customers nearby exchanged glances, some murmuring under their breath, others simply staring. Maggie could feel their eyes on her, their judgment pressing down like a weight on her shoulders. Still, she stood her ground, forcing herself to stay composed. "It can't be like this," she said, her voice unsteady but determined. "I just want to understand what happened." Her words hung in the air, unanswered. And then, just when things couldn't seem worse, Todd Murphy stepped in. The branch manager moved toward the counter with a confident, almost arrogant stride. His presence commanded attention, and Brittany, who had been smug just moments ago, immediately straightened in her chair, her expression shifting from dismissive to deferential. She knew what Todd's arrival meant. For Maggie, it could only mean one thing. This was about to get even harder. But what Todd didn't know, what no one knew, was that someone had been watching. Someone unexpected. And everything was about to change. Brittany straightened in her seat, suddenly trying to appear more professional under Todd's watchful eye. Todd crossed his arms, his expression unreadable as he glanced at Maggie before shifting his focus to Brittany. His tone was sharp, impatient. "Is there a problem here?" Brittany forced a nervous smile, her confidence from earlier noticeably fading. "No, sir. Just a customer having trouble understanding the account policies," she said quickly, eager to stay in Todd's good graces. Maggie, already feeling small under their scrutiny, took a step forward, trying to clarify. "That's not it," she said, her voice wavering but firm. "I believe there's been a mistake with my account. I'm just trying to get it resolved." Todd didn't even let her finish. He raised his hand, silencing her like she was a child interrupting a conversation. "Ma'am, if you think there's been a mistake, you should have read the contract before opening your account," he said flatly. The words hit Maggie like a slap. He wasn't just dismissing her concerns, he was blaming her. And just like that, the sinking feeling in her chest deepened. Todd's expression didn't waver as he delivered his next words with pointed arrogance. "Everything is very clear for those who pay attention." Maggie blinked, caught off guard by the sheer bluntness of his tone. For a moment, she just stood there, stunned. She swallowed hard, steadying herself before speaking. "I've always kept my account in good standing," she said, trying to stay calm. "These charges appeared out of nowhere. All I'm asking is for someone to review them." Todd let out a short, almost mocking laugh. "Review?" he repeated, shaking his head slightly. "Ma'am, what's in the system is in the system. We don't review something that's automatic." Maggie felt the humiliation deepen, settling in her chest like a heavy stone. It wasn't just what he said. It was how he said it. Cold, dismissive. As if she wasn't worth his time. As if she was nothing. And for the first time, she wondered if anyone in this building even saw her as a person. To Todd Murphy, Maggie wasn't just wrong. She wasn't worth his time at all. She turned, searching the faces around her, hoping for even a single look of sympathy. But all she found was indifference. Some customers quickly averted their eyes, pretending not to see. Others whispered among themselves, their expressions unreadable. No one spoke up. Todd leaned in slightly over the counter, his voice low but sharp, his words cutting like a blade. "If you can't afford the fees, maybe this bank isn't the right place for you." Maggie's lips parted, but the words wouldn't come. The mix of indignation and shame tangled in her throat, making it impossible to speak. She looked down at the envelope in her hands, her fingers tightening around it as if it were the only thing anchoring her in that moment. She had walked into this bank expecting fairness. Instead, she was being told to leave. Todd straightened, already moving on, as if the conversation had ended. To him, it had. But what he didn't know was that someone had just stepped forward, and everything was about to change. To Todd, Maggie was nothing more than an inconvenience, just another customer he could brush aside without a second thought. But then, something unexpected happened. From across the bank, a man in a casual jacket and a baseball cap had been watching the entire exchange, his sharp eyes taking in every word, every dismissive gesture. He hadn't drawn attention to himself, not yet. But when Todd uttered those final, cutting words, the man had heard enough. A voice, calm yet firm, sliced through the tension like a knife. "Why are you speaking to her like that?" The entire bank froze. Every conversation stopped. Every head turned toward the man who had just spoken. At first glance, he seemed ordinary. Just another customer, another face in the crowd. But within seconds, everyone would realize he was anything but ordinary. The atmosphere in the bank shifted instantly. A thick silence settled over the room as every eye locked onto the man who had just spoken. Dressed in a casual jacket and a baseball cap, he might have seemed unremarkable at first glance. But there was something in the way he stood, calm, unwavering, in complete control, that made people pay attention. His presence alone commanded respect, even before they realized who he was. Maggie turned to him, stunned. Someone, finally, was standing up for her. Across the counter, Todd Murphy's expression darkened. Annoyed, irritated, challenged. He turned slowly, his posture stiff, his ego already bruised. His voice carried the weight of authority, but also a flicker of defensiveness. "And who are you to question what's happening here?" The man took a step forward, slowly reaching up to remove his cap. And in that moment, the entire bank collectively held its breath. Because now, everyone knew exactly who he was. Todd crossed his arms, his brow furrowing as he repeated himself, this time with more irritation. "What's happening here?" The man took a few slow steps forward, his movements deliberate. Then, in one smooth motion, he reached up and removed his cap. For a brief second, there was silence. Then, a murmur rippled through the room, growing louder by the second. Keanu Reeves. Yes. Him. The world-famous actor was standing right there, in the middle of the bank. And now, everyone knew it. Despite the sudden shift in energy, the whispers, the stunned expressions, Keanu remained completely composed. His face was calm, but his eyes never left Todd. "It doesn't matter who I am," he said, his voice steady, controlled. "What matters is why you're treating this lady like this." Maggie gasped softly, her breath catching in her throat. She stared at him, her mind struggling to process what was happening. Was this real? Was Keanu Reeves really standing beside her, standing up for her? And if so, what was about to happen next? Maggie stared at Keanu, barely able to believe what was happening. Of all the people in the world, him, standing here, defending her? Todd took a deep breath, straightening his posture, clearly trying to regain control of the situation. He forced a polite, but strained, smile. "Mr. Reeves, I had no idea you were here," he said, his voice carefully measured. "But look, this is none of your business. We have policies at this bank, and this lady isn't meeting the requirements." Keanu tilted his head slightly, studying Todd for a long moment. Then, he gave a faint, ironic smile. "Policies," he repeated, his voice smooth but unmistakably sharp. His expression darkened, his tone cool but piercing. Or just an excuse to humiliate someone who's simply trying to solve a problem? The words landed like a slap. Even Brittany, who had been brimming with confidence moments ago, suddenly glanced nervously at Todd, waiting to see how he would respond. Because it was clear now, Keanu Reeves wasn't just here to watch. He was here to hold them accountable, and Todd was quickly running out of places to hide. Brittany glanced nervously at Todd, her confidence from earlier now shaken. She was waiting, hoping for him to say something, anything, that would justify what had just happened. But before Todd could even open his mouth, Keanu turned to Maggie. His expression softened, his voice now gentle. "Ma'am, what exactly is the problem? Can you show me what's going on?" Maggie hesitated. Everything felt surreal. But then she looked into Keanu's eyes, calm, patient, sincere. Slowly, she handed him the envelope. Keanu took it carefully, unfolding the papers with deliberate focus. His eyes scanned the documents, his brows slightly furrowing. A few seconds passed. Then he looked up, straight at Todd. "This is a mistake." The words were simple, but they carried weight. Keanu held up the papers. "These charges shouldn't be here. You're going to fix this, right now." Todd opened his mouth to argue, but before he could get a word out, Keanu raised a hand, silencing him instantly. "If this is a mistake, you'll fix it," he said, his voice steady but firm. The entire bank watched in silence. For the first time, Todd Murphy wasn't the one in control, and he knew it. Keanu's eyes locked onto Todd, his voice turning even colder. "And if it's not, it's going to be much worse for you." The weight of those words hung in the air. The entire bank stood in stunned silence. No one had expected Keanu Reeves, a Hollywood legend, to step in, let alone with such authority. But he wasn't finished yet. Keanu placed the envelope on the counter, his gaze unyielding. "I want you to review this, immediately." His voice was calm, but there was no room for argument. "And I'm not leaving until everything is resolved." Todd opened his mouth, but no words came out. He was speechless. But what he didn't realize, what no one realized yet, was that Keanu was just beginning to connect the dots. Because this wasn't just about Maggie. And soon, Todd Murphy would wish he had handled things differently. Visibly uncomfortable, Todd adjusted his collar, his face now tense with unease. And for the first time, he felt something he wasn't used to feeling. Fear. Todd adjusted the collar of his shirt, his fingers fumbling slightly. He flicked a tense glance at Brittany, silently pleading for backup. But Brittany looked just as lost as he did. For the first time, neither of them had control of the situation. And Keanu wasn't about to wait. He leaned slightly over the counter, his presence steady, calm, but unwavering. "We're not just talking about a simple mistake here, are we?" he said, his voice smooth but cutting. "We're talking about how you're treating a customer who deserves respect." His gaze flicked between them, sharp and unrelenting. And from what I've seen, that's clearly lacking here. The words landed like a hammer. The silence stretched unbearably long, until Brittany finally tried to break it. Her voice wavered slightly. "Mr. Reeves, maybe you don't understand how the system works. We follow strict..." But she didn't get to finish. Because Keanu wasn't interested in excuses, and he was about to make that very clear. "Strict guidelines?" Keanu repeated, his tone laced with quiet skepticism. He lifted his hand again, cutting Brittany off, polite, but firm. "I understand enough to know that these fees are completely arbitrary, and I also know you have the autonomy to correct them." His words were measured, unshakable. Beside him, Maggie stood frozen, her hands clasped together as if trying to ground herself in reality. She was still in disbelief over what was happening. This wasn't just someone standing up for her. This was Keanu Reeves, fighting for her. He glanced down at her, his expression softening. Then, in a voice calm but full of certainty, he said, "Don't worry. We're going to sort this out." And somehow, in that moment, Maggie believed him. The entire bank was watching now, customers, staff, even the security guard by the door. No one spoke. No one moved. Because everyone wanted to see what would happen next. Keanu took the envelope back, unfolding the papers with precision. Holding up the documents, he directed his attention straight at Todd. "These statements," he said, his voice steady but firm. He pointed to a section on the page. "The charges started 2 months ago, correct?" Maggie nodded, her voice soft but certain. "Yes." Keanu turned back to Todd, his expression unreadable but undeniably intense. "Then tell me, why did these maintenance fees triple?" His words cut through the air like a blade. "Because from what I see, there's no legitimate reason for it." Todd shifted uncomfortably, his lips parting as if to respond. But Keanu wasn't done. Before Todd could even form an excuse, Keanu raised a hand, again, cutting him off. His next words were colder, sharper. "You might want to think carefully about your answer." He took a slow step closer, lowering his voice just enough to make every word hit harder. "Because if this is something bigger than a mistake, then you, and everyone here, are going to have a much bigger problem on your hands." The weight of those words sent a chill through the room. And Todd? For the first time, he looked truly afraid. Keanu's words hung heavy in the air. "You're going to have a much bigger problem on your hands." The tension was palpable. The employees, who had once been indifferent, now looked visibly nervous. Todd could feel the weight of every set of eyes on him. His usual tactics, brushing people off, dodging accountability, weren't going to work this time. His throat went dry. He swallowed hard and took a step back. I'll need to review this in the system," he stammered, his voice shaky. Keanu didn't blink. He simply crossed his arms, his stare unwavering. "Then start. Now." Todd flinched at the command. Without hesitation, he turned and rushed to his computer, his fingers scrambling over the keyboard as if his life depended on it. Maggie watched in astonishment. Just moments ago, she had been ignored, dismissed, humiliated. Now, the same people who had treated her as insignificant were scrambling to fix their mistake. Brittany, who had once been so smug, was now panicking, her fingers twitching as she tried to keep up with Todd's frantic search. The once confident employees were no longer in control. Keanu was, and everyone knew it. Keanu remained steadfast by Maggie's side. What had initially seemed like a simple mistake was quickly unraveling into something much bigger. Todd stood up from his chair, his face pale, his forehead glistening with sweat. His voice was hesitant, almost defeated. "Mr. Reeves, there's something wrong here." Keanu leaned in slightly, his expression unreadable. "Wrong? How?" Todd hesitated. His eyes darted toward Maggie for a brief second before flicking back to Keanu. And then, he finally admitted the truth. "It looks like these charges were applied to multiple accounts, mostly belonging to elderly customers." The room grew even quieter. Keanu slowly shook his head, a look of disgust flashing in his eyes. That's not a mistake. His voice was lower now, almost deadly calm. He took a step closer. That's a scheme, a deliberate act, a systematic targeting of the most vulnerable customers. And now, everyone in the bank knew it. Maggie wasn't the only victim, and Keanu knew it. What started as a simple banking error had just unraveled into something much bigger. This wasn't just about one woman being overcharged. It was about systematic exploitation, and Keanu was about to expose it all. Todd, now in full panic mode, desperately searched for a way out, but there was no escape. The walls were closing in. His hands trembled as he fidgeted with his tie, his breath coming in short, uneven gasps. His entire demeanor had shifted. The smug confidence was gone, replaced with sheer terror. He tried to explain, his voice unsteady, barely keeping up with the weight of what was unfolding. "Mr. Reeves, I swear this was a system error," Todd stammered, his words tumbling over themselves. "It's not something we did on—" But Keanu didn't blink. He didn't move. He simply stared him down, his presence unshakable. And Todd? Todd was running out of lies. Keanu narrowed his eyes, his arms crossing slowly over his chest. "A system error," he repeated, his voice laced with cold skepticism. "How convenient." His stare bore into Todd, giving him no room to escape. "Tell me, why do these errors only seem to affect elderly accounts?" The question hung in the air, sharp and undeniable. "Did you really think no one would notice?" Maggie turned, her indignation finally boiling over. She had been silent long enough. Her voice, though still shaken, held a newfound strength. "So I'm not the only one?" she asked, staring directly at Todd. "How many people have you cheated?" A murmur spread through the bank. And Todd? He had no answer. It was clear to everyone now. There was no justification, no loophole he could hide behind. Brittany, standing beside him, looked even more nervous now, her fingers twitching as if she knew something much bigger was about to come to light. Todd opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. His voice failed him. Because deep down, he knew. This wasn't just a mistake. This was a scandal. And there was no talking his way out of it now. Todd's voice trembled as he grasped for an escape. I'll investigate this. I just need more time to figure it out." Keanu didn't move. Then, without breaking eye contact, he stepped forward, placing his hands firmly on the counter. "You've had enough time." His voice was low, unwavering, deadly serious. "Now, you're going to tell the truth." Todd visibly panicked, his breath uneven as he stumbled backward. Keanu's eyes bore into him. "How many people have been affected by this? Tell the truth." The entire bank held its breath. Todd swallowed hard, his eyes darting toward Brittany in desperation, but she only looked away, her face pale, refusing to meet his gaze, and then he cracked. I'm not sure." His voice was barely above a whisper. "Maybe hundreds." The room fell into stunned silence. This wasn't just about Maggie. This was a calculated scheme that had hurt hundreds of people. Keanu's jaw tightened. He wasn't going to let this slide. Without hesitation, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. Because if the bank thought they could cover this up, they were about to find out just how wrong they were. Without hesitation, Keanu hit record. The bank was silent. Every eye locked on him as he held up his phone, the camera aimed directly at Todd and Brittany. "What you're hearing is a bank manager admitting that his bank has been charging elderly customers unjust fees to boost profits," Keanu said, his voice calm but deadly serious. His words echoed through the room like a verdict. "This is unacceptable, and we're going to make sure everyone knows what's happening here." Todd's face turned ashen. Panic set in. He threw up his hands in desperation. "Wait, please." Don't do that. His voice cracked, his confidence completely shattered. We can fix this. I can fix it right now. Keanu lowered his phone slightly, but his expression didn't soften. His voice remained firm, unshaken. Fix it? He repeated, his tone colder now. This isn't just about returning the money. He took a slow step forward, his eyes locked onto Todd. This is about justice. He let the words sink in. Do you really think an apology is enough? The tension in the room was suffocating, because everyone knew this wasn't going away. Not anymore. Todd stared at Keanu, his face pale, sweat dripping from his brow. His voice wavered, barely above a whisper. What do you want from me? Keanu didn't blink. He leaned in slightly, his gaze locked onto Todd's with unshakable intensity. I want you to make this right, for every single person who was affected. His voice was calm, but his words carried absolute authority. And I want the authorities to know exactly what happened here. A final sentence, a demand, a reckoning. At that moment, Todd knew there was no way out, no excuses, no backpedaling, no escaping accountability. He swallowed hard, his shoulders slumping as defeat settled in. Slowly, he nodded. Keanu stood firm, his presence unwavering. Because this wasn't just about Maggie. This was about every victim who had been taken advantage of. And justice was finally being served. Hours later, the bank released an official statement. The changes were swift. Todd and Brittany, removed. The fees, reimbursed. The scheme, exposed. Because one woman dared to stand her ground, and because one man refused to let injustice go unnoticed. Todd and Brittany were removed from their positions immediately. But the fallout didn't stop there. A full audit was launched to uncover just how many accounts had been affected by the unjust fees. Maggie, standing beside Keanu, received more than just an apology. She was fully reimbursed for every dollar that had been unfairly taken from her, and more. The bank, desperate to salvage its reputation, provided additional compensation for the stress and hardship she had endured. As a visibly embarrassed bank representative stepped forward, his voice was carefully measured. Mrs. Thompson, on behalf of the bank, we sincerely apologize for this terrible situation. He cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably. We are committed to correcting this immediately. Maggie looked up at Keanu, tears welling in her eyes. Her voice was barely above a whisper. I never could have done this alone. Her hands trembled, not with fear but with overwhelming gratitude, because for the first time in a long time, she felt seen, she felt heard, she felt valued. And it was all because one person refused to stay silent. Maggie's voice was thick with emotion. Thank you for believing in me. Keanu offered a small smile, his expression warm but resolute. You should never have gone through this. His voice was steady, but there was a weight behind his words. Then, he glanced around, his gaze shifting to the stunned employees, the silent customers, the people who had watched but said nothing. But now, this isn't just about you, Maggie. He gestured subtly to the room. We're helping so many others who were wronged too. Maggie nodded, her heart full, her spirit lighter. As she stepped outside, something in her had changed. She was still the same humble woman, but now, there was a renewed spark in her eyes. Hope, strength, dignity restored. Keanu stood beside her for a moment, then turned back toward the crowd, the tellers, the customers, the people still waiting in line. He studied their faces, seeing the impact of what had just unfolded. Some were ashamed, some were inspired, and then, with calm clarity, he spoke. Never let anyone tell you that you're worth less. His voice carried through the room, firm but full of conviction. Whether you're elderly. He paused, letting the words settle. Because everyone in that bank needed to hear them, and no one would forget them. Young, wealthy, or struggling, everyone deserves respect. Keanu's voice was strong, unwavering. And most importantly, never be afraid to fight for what's right. The words hung in the air, sinking into the hearts of everyone in the room. Then, applause. It started with just 1 or 2 claps, hesitant at first. But within seconds, the entire bank erupted into cheers. Even the customers who had stood in silence before now clapped with conviction, their faces filled with something new. Understanding. Keanu turned back to Maggie, a soft but knowing smile on his face. He lifted a hand in a discreet wave, a silent farewell that spoke volumes. Maggie nodded, her eyes shining with gratitude. And then, he walked out, leaving behind a lesson no one would soon forget. Days later, the video of Keanu exposing the bank's scheme went viral. It spread like wildfire, racking up millions of views. People everywhere watched in shock, outraged by the injustice, inspired by the stand he had taken. The bank, forced into a full investigation. But more importantly, the victims, they began to recover what had been stolen from them. Because one woman stood up for herself, and because one man made sure the world listened. Maggie's story became more than just a call for justice. It became a symbol of hope, a reminder that no one should be overlooked, that respect and justice should be the only rules we follow. Because in the end, it wasn't just about one woman reclaiming what was hers. It was about every person who had ever been dismissed, every voice that had ever been ignored, and the undeniable truth that doing what's right always matters. So let this story inspire you to stand up, to speak out, to act with courage and empathy, no matter where you are. Did this story move you? Then share it, spread the message, and comment below. Respect is for everyone. Because when we stand together, we create a wave of humanity that cannot be ignored. Thank you for listening to the whole story. Have a good day.